Hello, hello, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. I'm Michael Green, the Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and a professor at Georgetown University. And we're joined today by a friend and thought leader on Indo-Pacific strategy, Professor Rory Medcalf, to talk about his new book, which is called Indo-Pacific Empire, China, America, and the Contest for the World's Pivotal Region. And we'll also be joined by my colleague at CSIS, Bonnie Glazer, in a discussion with Rory Medcalf about his book, about developments in the region. The book is a fantastic read. We would normally have piles on a table for you to buy and for Rory to sign, but I assume, Rory, it can be found. You will tell us on Kindle or Apple or whatever electronic ebook version you prefer.
Can be done.
So Rory Medcalf is a well-known intellectual on strategy in the Indo-Pacific, and his resume pretty much screams Indo-Pacific. He worked in the Australian Office of National Assessment, now Office of National Intelligence, as an intelligence analyst on the region. He has served in the Australian Embassy in Delhi. He's done a tour in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, spent a lot of time in Washington. So his career is a kind of quad in miniature, if you will. And Rory is really the person who put this concept, this geopolitical mental map of the Indo-Pacific forward and proselytized it, I would say, 10 years ago, with some resistance in some quarters, Beijing, but also some parts of Washington and Canberra. It is now the mainstream view that the strategic space we should be envisioning in a period of shifting power relations in this region is the Indo-Pacific, not East Asia, not the Asia-Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific, taking advantage, of course, of India's increasingly important role. And Australia is, of course, at the pivot of the Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans. Rory is now the head of the National Security College at Australia National University, where he does a combination of think tank research and training the next generation of Australian strategic and policy leaders. So we'll start, Rory, with a quick overview from you, and I think you have some slides to share with us on the book on Indo-Pacific Empire, and then I'll let Bonnie quiz you for a bit. We'll have a discussion, and the audience can send their questions to us, and we'll be looking for those as we progress. So Rory, over to you, and welcome. I wish we were in Washington or Canberra together, but it's great to see you.
Thank you indeed, Mike, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all at this virtual event for the book. Look, I will just very briefly introduce a few of the key themes from this book, and I will indulge in sharing a few of the maps and images that I think tell the story better than I can. But I'm especially interested in the discussion and the what next. So why did I write this book? And I'm just going to quickly call up those images as we speak. Yeah, so why this book? And interestingly, there are actually two covers to this book. The first is that the idea has been around for much longer, I think, than many of us realize. The idea that what we saw as the Maritime Asian region is really a system based on the two oceans, the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. And that was, I guess, somewhat clouded in the late 20th century by the idea of the Asia-Pacific, which was a mental map that was extremely useful and important at the time for, obviously, the sustained engagement of the United States in the region, for the, I guess, integration of the rising tiger economies, for Australia's and Southeast Asia's own future. But the argument in the book is twofold. It's that, in fact, the longer view, the longer history of Asia as a strategic system was a two-ocean region. And in fact, the further back into my research that I delved, the more, I guess, I was convinced that the norm was a kind of early multipolarity in the Asian region. In other words, the Indian Ocean always mattered. The civilizations centered on India and on the coastline of India and on Southeast Asia always mattered. And this was a region where China was prominent but not dominant. Its dominance was confined very much to a narrower East Asian sub-region. The second, I guess, key message of the book is not only that there is a connectivity across the Indo-Pacific which creates this vast canvas for strategic competition today, but also that the multipolarity that results from looking at the Asian system, or an Asia-centric system as the Indo-Pacific, that multipolarity will make life very difficult for China as it seeks to exert its dominance, and in fact plays to the advantage of the players in the middle, countries like Australia, Indonesia, India, Japan, as they seek to cope with this assertive and indeed more than assertive power, and also as they seek to cope with what many of us on this side of the region see as, and I suspect more than a few in America as well, see as the dysfunction of the Trump administration in its external engagement and internally as well. And so the Indo-Pacific, in my argument, and it's certainly not my argument alone, but this larger mental map for strategic power competition provides a basis for finding over time what I would call a settling point for China's overreach. Its overreach, it's almost imperial overreach. So to quickly skirt through, I guess, some of the images that illustrate this. As you can see, and this particular map borrowed from the Australian government's defence white paper that really was the first statement by a government that the region is the Indo-Pacific. Emphasised, this is 7 years ago now, emphasised the sea lanes, the energy dependence of China and East Asia on the Indian Ocean, reaching across to Africa and the Middle East, the intense traffic, if you like, that made the Indo-Pacific the centre of gravity for commerce and also increasingly for strategic rivalry. And look, there are plenty of arguments to say that China's set of interests is not the same in the Indo-Pacific as it is in the narrow waters of East Asia. But what's been really striking for observers like me in recent years is that even though the Chinese leadership at one level decries the term Indo-Pacific, through the Belt and Road, China's been almost acting Indo-Pacific. And so the book then, I guess, leaps back from recent developments such as the really quite exceptional strengthening of the Japan-India relationship, Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, the sudden, I guess, not sudden, but the announcement by the US administration that it will engage in the region, or at least compete with China in the region as the Indo-Pacific. The turn by countries like Indonesia, many of the ASEANs, Australia, France, to begin to look at the region this way. The book turns then to take a quick journey through the history of the region, to tell that story that, in fact, as we saw through civilizations past, the Hindu empires in Southeast Asia, for example, the journey of Islam to the region, the adventures, the short-lived adventures of the Chinese fleet in the Indian Ocean in the 1400s, and then, of course, the arrival of European colonialism with all of the impacts that it brought. We were looking across really a two-ocean system all the time, and I guess if I had more time, I'd go into greater depth on that. But what fascinated me is that the mental maps of the strategic and economic connections that mattered, and this particular image from 1570 really tells it all for me. Those maps have been the same broadly throughout history, except for that brief interlude of the Asia-Pacific in the second half of the 20th century that artificially left the Indian Ocean and India, if you like, out of the frame. So in a sense, we're returning to something that is a bit older, a bit more organic than some, I guess, strategic map made in Washington, which of course is what China would like the Indo-Pacific to be seen as. Just sort of skipping through back to the present day, and there's a narrative, if you like, about how and why the region turned away from the Indo-Pacific in the mid-20th century, with China and India, their economies in particular, turning inwards, and the global fulcrum really being on the Cold War in the North Atlantic. But to move to the present day, the argument that I make is that, in a sense, it's the expansion of Chinese interests and influence across the seas, the Belt and Road, or the Maritime Silk Road, the military footprint that we're increasingly seeing follow that, particularly into the Indian Ocean. These developments from around 1993 onwards, the seeming height of the Asia-Pacific moment, set in train the neo-colonial story that we're beginning to see in the region now. A many-layered competition, Chinese influence economically, much of that understandable, but also backed up with, I guess, more sinister forms of influence, with a competition over geoeconomics, over resources, over technology, a growing military footprint, an intelligence footprint. And I guess I make the argument that this is going to be unsustainable for China, that it doesn't matter, in a sense, it does matter, it matters enormously whether the United States can get its act together in the way that allies want, but it matters less than those who say that the whole strategic competition is really just a US-China story. I make the argument that certainly within a 20 to 30 year time frame, and that's not long in the grand sweep of Chinese history, and probably sooner than that, we're seeing COVID almost accelerating this process. Within that time frame, the cracks will really show in China's accelerated imperial ambitions. So if you look at the way in which China envisions the world, the Belt and Road is the benign version, but of course there is a military footprint exposed, in a sense, in this image from the Battle Command Center in Beijing 3 years ago. China is going to be, under Xi Jinping, is going to be facing really intense pushback on many fronts. And of course, it's an enormous question as to whether, in fact, China will prevail or we will find some kind of settling point, whether, in fact, US-China tensions are going to escalate to a conflict that will shake things further. These are all questions that I guess the book leaves unresolved. I want to leave in readers' minds just the recognition that the US-China competition is not the only game in town, that really through China's expansion across an Indo-Pacific footprint, it's picking fights, not all of them necessary for its interests, with powers ranging from India to Japan to Australia to Vietnam, and even potentially to the Europeans, and we'll come to that. And at the same time, and this goes to the key question of really what is occurring within China, or at least within China's angry periphery, and let's look there at Hong Kong, at Taiwan, at the Uyghurs and so forth, that this is not necessarily going to be manageable for a system that has staked increasingly under Xi Jinping so much of its internal legitimacy on its ability to be strong abroad, its ability to be assertive, and its ability to really try and break down all opposition. Those of us who've, I guess, engaged with the power relations of the Indo-Pacific over the years have taken the view that, have often taken the view that China is willing to take risks. The book argues that China is actually more risk averse than it likes us to think. And in a sense, and I'm not entirely joking when I throw up the poster for the Wolf Warrior movie here, in a sense, one of the vulnerabilities of the regime is that it has raised expectations among the population that China, that the state, that the party, that the PLA will be there to help Chinese nationals wherever they get into trouble in the region and the world. And that, in my mind, is partly the psychological, the narrative element to this almost neo-colonialism, this Indo-Pacific empire that the book talks about. The question being, when China finds itself in situations where it feels the need to take action, to deploy and to use force, how will things turn out? And that is, of course, the big unknown. Look, in conclusion, the book was in fact completed just on the eve of the COVID crisis. And of course, even when I went to print a little while ago, it wasn't clear for even for the Chinese leadership, I suspect, the full extent of the calamity that they were really seeing unfold, and that perhaps I think in very many ways, their own failures had contributed to. How will that shake up this Indo-Pacific picture? I'll leave that for the discussion, but I would note that in many ways, some of the trends I identify in the book have accelerated in recent months, particularly the willingness of small and middle powers in the Indo-Pacific to find new ways to collaborate. Many have predicted the death of the Quad repeatedly for quite some time, but it's striking that the Quad is actually now the core, for example, of a 7-nation grouping, bringing in Vietnam, bringing in South Korea, and also bringing in New Zealand, that is regularly discussing pandemic response, issues to do with long-term security, including against the geo-economic consequences of the pandemic. I'm going to leave it there, and I would like to, I guess, join a conversation on particularly on the 2 or 3 themes, again, just to recap them, that we're operating in a much larger strategic system now than we were a few decades ago, that is not necessarily going to work to China's advantage, that the Indian Ocean in particular creates vulnerability for China. Secondly, that there's this connection between the internal and the external in China's, I guess, push into the Indo-Pacific that actually makes China more vulnerable to risk and perhaps less 10 feet tall than it likes to project. And thirdly, that the COVID crisis is going to accelerate many of these dynamics rather than completely change the landscape. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to some questions.
You're muted, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Rory. I lost my my desktop in the middle of your presentation. I had to switch to my iPhone, which is hopefully good enough for you to hear me.
Absolutely.
So, Rory, we didn't see the images. Can you share screen again and show the pictures for us?
Ah, right. I should have been warned. That's fine.
Maybe go through them very briefly.
Yeah. No. Look, I won't take up too much time with that. But you can see that now.
Yeah. Please, I don't see them.
Did you share your screen?
Yeah. Yeah. We might be having a technical issue there.
Yeah, not working.
Yeah. It doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't.
We'll come.
Yeah. You've got that
there we
now?
Go.
Yeah. Look, I'll just hit you with a couple of key images, I guess, because I don't want to waste too much of the discussion time. Look, the key point I wanted to make is that this is the map of the Australian Defence Department map that captured that sense of the 2-ocean region 7 years ago. And the point I was going to make is how strikingly similar, in fact, that is to the way the region has been imagined throughout history. You know, Korean map from the 1400s, European map from the 1500s, Australian map from the 1800s, and a 21st century Chinese depiction of the region and the world, which is, I'm told, quite popular with the PLA Navy. And interestingly, if you look at that Chinese depiction, that Chinese projection of 7 years ago, the American continent has been cut in two and thrown to the outer reaches of the universe. So it's kind of a mental map as a strategic wishful thinking. Belt and Road, I argue, is very much, particularly the Maritime Silk Road, is really the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics. It's really almost a vindication of the Indo-Pacific, not a repudiation of it, which of course the Chinese leadership likes to say. And strikingly, there is a military and security footprint. I mentioned the Battle Command Center here in Beijing 3 years ago. And in this image, fascinatingly, that was projected to the Chinese people as propaganda about China's international reach. The Indian Ocean is at the centre of the image. It's a battle command centre. This is a propaganda picture, but nonetheless, the PLA is looking at the broad Indo-Pacific as a theatre of operations. And I refer to strategic competition across all of the dimensions: economic, military, narrative, diplomatic, and so forth, espionage. I referred also to the many levels of confrontation and friction that China is, I think, unwisely exacerbating on its angry periphery, on its border with neighbours such as India, with Vietnam, with Japan. Big questions, of course, over how powerful the United States or how effective the United States is going to be in the region in the years to come. But I have accentuated the multipolarity of the Indo-Pacific, and I've also talked about the way China raises and has raised, I think, often unwisely, the expectations of the public that the PLA will be there at all times to help them out. As I said, risk aversion has in fact been a characteristic, along with an assertiveness, a salami slicing, a kind of a bullying tactic. But in fact, deep down, a risk aversion, an unwillingness to go all the way to conflict, and we should be grateful for that. But nonetheless, that's an opportunity, I think, for others in the Indo-Pacific. A risk aversion has been characteristic of the coercive activity that China has undertaken in the region. And that's going to, I think, change. It's going to have to change, because there'll be friction points where the raised expectations of the Chinese people will lead to a need to take action across this increasingly neo-colonial, almost imperial expanse of the Indo-Pacific for China. So that's a quick tour of the images, and we now have still plenty of time for a conversation.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you, Rory. I'm glad you were able to walk us through those. And as you were speaking, NASA announced that it's postponing the launch, which was scheduled for 4:30. So clearly they know they can't compete with the Indo-Pacific Empire and your compelling images. So I'm going to turn to Bonnie now and ask her to give some views on the thesis, ask you a question. Let me remind the audience, you can ask questions by sending them to us through the CSIS website. If you go to csis.org, and go to the events icon, there's a prompt that'll let you send questions. We'll get them on a Google document, and I'll go through them in a few minutes. But let's turn it over now to my colleague Bonnie Glaser.
Congratulations on the publication of your book, Rory. It's terrific, and I think it's going to stimulate a really excellent conversation, certainly among us today, but also worldwide, as the Indo-Pacific really takes root as a concept, and it really has over the last couple of years. And of course, you at least partly need to take credit for that. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, really honing in on the final chapter of the book, which is really the policy implications. You rightly focus on China's coercion as the main challenge, and I agree with your statement that China is not seeking military conflict. Rather, it wants to use economic statecraft and military pressure and political interference, other gray zone tactics, to persuade and in some cases compel countries to accede to Chinese interests. So the main challenge, therefore, going forward is how to manage coercion without, as you note, either creating an outcome of military conflict at one end of the spectrum or capitulation to Chinese demands at the other. And, many countries are obviously trying to navigate this challenge. Yet we have to be, I think, quite realistic in recognizing that some countries have capitulated, at least partly or perhaps temporarily. The Philippines under Duterte has set aside the arbitral tribunal ruling that was in its favor to get Chinese loans and ease Chinese pressure on the Philippines. Apart from Vietnam, there really isn't much pushback in the South China Sea, a lot of unhappiness, but not a lot of pushback among the other claimants. Even South Korea didn't fully cave in and remove the THAAD missile defense system, but it agreed to not deploy more missile defense systems or network its systems with other countries or establish a trilateral alliance with the US and Japan. So there has already been some capitulation. And so your prescription that countries in the Indo-Pacific must band together is absolutely right, but seems to me easier said than done. ASEAN is struggling to stay united as China pushes for this toothless code of conduct. The United States is in some ways abandoning leadership and leaving others to take the lead in organizing pushback against China. And the Chinese continue to try to drive wedges between other countries. So this terrific sentence in your book where you say, others' resistance to excessive and coercive actions by China can firm up into comprehensive competition underpinned by resilient solidarity and deterrence. Can it? Yes, but will it? Is Indo-Pacific solidarity achievable? And I'd like to draw you out a little bit on what gives you confidence that this will hold in the future. My second point is about your analysis of Chinese foreign policy and its drivers. And I was quite surprised at your statement that China will have to adjust to the interests and sensitivities of others. Now, I really have to ask you why you think that is likely. As Chinese economic, diplomatic, military clout have grown, China has become less flexible, not more magnanimous and willing to compromise with its neighbors. Xi Jinping is certainly more risk tolerant. Chinese assertiveness, of course, predates his coming to power. So I wouldn't associate all of the assertiveness and aggressiveness with Xi Jinping. Nationalism is a potent force in China. It's being fomented on a daily basis. The Chinese, of course, want to return their country to what they think is the rightful place in the world, with China at the center. And this resonates with the Chinese people. So is there really a scenario in which China compromises on what it sees as its core interests, that it accepts Taiwan, for example, its existence as an entity separate from the PRC? Would China actually give up its claims in the South China Sea? So I'm really interested in how you see, why you see that China is going to adjust to the interests and sensitivity of others. And then I have one last quick point, and that is that you posit that Chinese power relative to the Indo-Pacific has already peaked. You talked about this a little bit in your opening remarks. But I'd like to hear you sort of elaborate on this. I mean, China's economic growth will stagnate this year. But even then, you know, China's increased defense spending it's still 6.6%. The IMF has estimated the economy will grow by 1.2%. So this demonstrates a commitment to sustaining the development of China's hard power. So what is it that's really going to make China weaker relative to the broader Indo-Pacific? So just a couple of thoughts, fantastic book, and look forward to a conversation.
Great. Rory, why don't you take those on? Then I have a couple for you.
That's brilliant. Look, thank you. And Bonnie, I think you've rightly gone to, I think, three of the really key critiques of the analysis, and there's something in all of them. Look, I guess to set the scene a little bit, you know, I deliberately take a long view in the book, and that's one of the reasons for the indulgence into the long historical record, to say that this was always a region that was messier, that was more multipolar, more contested, and larger as a system than I think a lot of contemporary analysis suggests. And I think importantly, this was not the same region that the Chinese propaganda narrative that China is naturally the center of the region, that this will be, if you like, China's place to dominate would suggest. And that long view is important because if we look at, let's say, a generation, 20, 25 years, if we look at that time frame into the future, there are many plausible futures, and we're seeing one of those futures. Well, we're seeing the future unfold very rapidly this year. But I guess I still accept the argument that that China, one of the reasons for the rapid assertiveness of China over the past decade, and it's not just undersea, but particularly accentuated undersea, is that sense that now is the time, that there is the window of opportunity. But the window of opportunity, yes, it's partly because maybe others, particularly the United States, were in the end, or at least in the beginning, going back 6 or 7 years, less resistant than perhaps China had expected. But also because if you aggregate the challenges China is going to have internally, that obviously with demographics, with debt, with environmental issues, and with the, in fact, the mosaic of unrest that we see, that there's never going to be a better time. And in fact, it's only going to get harder over time to be assertive. The rapid accumulation of interests, I mean, I think the fact that we've obviously seen a creative redefinition of core interests over the years, and now we have plenty of non-core interests in the Indian Ocean, in the Indo-Pacific, in Africa, a very, very vast sweep. And most of imperial peripheral interests may not be core, but nonetheless, China seems willing to take action and deploy capabilities and raise expectations over them. That's in fact where I see more of the unexpected pressure points, and the areas where there is going to be that need for some kind of, I guess, creative compromise. I slightly, with some degree of mischief, deliberately looked at projections for the rest of the region alongside projections for China when I wrote the book. And this was pre-COVID, so of course the fact that everyone's economy is taking a hit, and of course some, and look at India at the moment, some are going to take a much bigger hit than others in the short to medium term. That's going to play into this to a large degree, but it's still striking that so much of the pushback against China, and I don't sort of agree that in defining capitulation, I don't agree that much of the region has comprehensively capitulated yet, with the exception of a few small countries, Laos, Cambodia. Philippines is a big question mark. I see that as more in play. I would, I guess, make the case that we're at the start of a long game. We're not at a point where China is closing the net. The easy stuff, I think, for the PRC is over. I posit an argument in the book that there are, as I say, 5 principles of coexistence, and I don't think that this is a contest where America is somehow going to necessarily hold or even regain primacy. And I do take issue with the idea that it's Chinese primacy versus American primacy. I posit an argument that there are really 5 principles that are going to help in finding a settling point for China, because I don't think that there's a clear sense yet in Beijing, and I'd be interested in your views on this, on what the endpoint looks like for the almost impulsive, I guess, expansion of interests and influence across the Indo-Pacific and across the world over the past 10 years. So I guess I make the argument that it's going to be often at the margins, all those multiple points of pushback and eventual strengthening into greater solidarity among others, that actually, in its own strange way, help the Chinese leadership find that point at which it essentially says enough. We've bitten off enough in the region and the world. The last point that I'd make there is really, and this still goes to that question of capitulation, is the connection between the internal and the external. I mean, you'd know, I guess, very clearly how the nationalism of the Chinese population has been cultivated, has been fostered. It's real, but nonetheless, it's not the only, I guess, impulse there driving Chinese policy. At what point does 1 or 2 or more acts of pushback by Japan, India, Vietnam, the non-military pushback that we're seeing increasingly, I'd say, in Europe, Australia, elsewhere, at what point does that bring about some kind of reassessment? And I would argue that even on the Belt and Road, not all the news is bad. We've seen, I think, a fundamental or substantial change in the packaging of the Belt and Road in the past few years to recognise that governance, that environmental issues, that labour rights, that all of the local needs that so many small and middle powers in the region have cried out about. And I'm even looking at small countries like Mauritius or Sri Lanka, or Malaysia, where a rapid democratic change of government can really upset China's calculations. We're already seeing a need to set new limits in China on that. We're also seeing, I think, the beginnings of that conversation in China about whether the Belt and Road is in fact going to cost the PRC more than it's worth. So I think that we do need to, I guess, inculcate a certain degree of, I wouldn't say patience necessarily, but strategic confidence in the many powers other than China in the region, that until we see a confrontation that really crosses that threshold into armed conflict, which I think one thing we agree on, China doesn't actually want, but we don't know, in fact, what the limits of Chinese assertiveness and risk-taking are. And we should in some ways, in fact, help hasten the day when China finds those out.
Bunny, you want to give a quick response to Rory's questions back at you? And then I have a few for Rory.
I'll just be very quick because I know we want to open up to questions, but I think the longer you look out, the more uncertainty there is. I agree with you that there are many different actors in the region that, if they work together, could force China to make choices that today it is unwilling to make. There are a lot of questions, of course, about Chinese leadership going forward. How long is Xi Jinping going to be in power? What will he be replaced with? I think leadership does matter in China. And if they can have national rejuvenation and say that they have achieved that, then maybe they can compromise on the degree to which they have total hegemony or primacy in the region. But those are very uncertain, I think, today. I believe that the Chinese don't have a blueprint for how to get to where they want to be going forward. They don't want U.S. alliances in the region, but I don't think they have a concrete plan for how to eliminate them. But it is something that they have laid on the table, as a marker. Whether there is a future again in which they reevaluate that and say, okay, we can live with these alliances. Those are still big questions. But I agree with you that if you're going to look out over many decades, that there is a greater chance of succeeding in finding some compromise between military conflict and capitulation.
Rory, let me ask you about the foundational geographic concepts behind the book. You, for a long time, have argued rightly that the way we label regions, the way we bureaucratically organize ourselves, conceive of regions, is really critical to strategy. And often those labels reflect the worldview of a country. So Americans called this region the Far East recently, but in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, Americans called it the East Indies because it was all about trade with Canton. In the 1850s, it was called the Far West by Seward and others because it was the next step in westward expansion across the continent. And in the 1950s, the East Asia Bureau was called the Far East Division, and it only included Japan and China, basically, because the rest of Southeast Asia and South Asia were in the Europe Bureau. So, and Australia has had its own evolution, reflecting Australian history and culture and threat perception. A number of people reviewing your book have said, that pointed out that you have an affinity for Mackinder's concept of the world island, the control of the Eurasian heartland, which is very much in the Chinese Belt and Road strategy. But your recommendations and your strategy is really Mahanian. I mean, it's centered on the Quad, it's centered on US, Japan, Australia, India, protecting the island chains, sea routes, maritime domains, and the norms of maritime democracy. So the first question is, how do you square that circle? A real Mahanian would say, we don't really care what happens in the continent. Let the Slavic and Chinese and other continental authoritarian people just do their thing. We have to protect ourselves from the oceans. So how do you square that? Then the second question for you is about multipolarity. I completely agree that if we in the US, Australia, Japan, India in particular, but overall, if we conceive of our chessboard as multipolar, we'll do much better. And there's a reason why Beijing a few years back was pushing a new model of great power relations. It was a completely bipolar US-China vision of the region that relegated Japan and Australia and India and Korea and Indonesia to sort of passenger status, bystander status. And Bonnie and I were critical of the Obama administration when they flirted with that idea for exactly that reason. It was meant to weaken the US by marginalizing our alignment in a multipolar world. So I think this has legs. This and the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. If Biden becomes president, the name will change, but I think the basic contours will survive. In part because the American people get it. In public opinion polls 8 years ago, a majority of Americans said we should have a G2 with China, even if it hurts our alliances. Last year, when that question was asked, 2/3 of Americans said we should strengthen our alliances, even if it hurts China. So the public, the Congress is completely behind this. The second question for you, though, is concepts of multipolarity historically and in Asian history are viewed as inherently unstable. Tripolarity is somewhat stable. There's a certain stability to the mutual assured destruction of bipolarity. Unipolarity, hegemonic stability, is the most stable. But a lot of theoreticians and historians, Henry Kissinger in his book on the Concert of Europe, argue that basically multipolarity is a lot of work. You're constantly refining and aligning, and it's very easy to get it wrong. So, should we feel good about this? I think it's a better play for us. But how stable is this system going to be? That's the second question. So explain the geography a little bit, and how stable is this multipolar world that we are heading into?
Thanks, Mike. They're both, I guess, both very insightful. And like on the mental maps, I'd probably be a little bit tricky there and say that I'm certainly closer to Mahan than Mackinder. I think in fact China's trying to have it both ways. Of course, the Belt and Road is the land and the sea. It's both. The book argues quite strongly that the sea will continue to matter more than the land, and in fact that the almost, I wouldn't say it's a distraction, but the overinvestment in the land-based activity by China is going to be economically very questionable. It's actually going to entangle China in security challenges it probably doesn't need. The PLA, however, has turned pretty definitively to the sea. I mean, it's a very open statement in recent years. China is rapidly finding this maritime destiny. And I guess the argument I make is that at sea, the others, particularly maritime democracies, will continue to have advantages that they should press home. That unless we see some very fundamental shifts in what is traded and how it is traded, that the sea is going to continue to have those extraordinary advantages of cost over land. And even with the massive COVID disruptions to trade, if we're taking a long view, it's still going to be about the sea. So I would actually say that my own view is more Mahanian. It's that China, in fact, is, I guess, playing it both ways because it is a continental power turning to the sea. And it's partly the overstretch of that confusion that's going to make life a little bit difficult for China. I'd also emphasise, very difficult, in fact, for China. I'd also emphasise that the history of visualising the region in mental maps that, of course, translate into the decisions of leaders, the allocation of resources, the creation of regional forums. These end up being very real things, the choices you make about what your military power projection looks like. These decisions, these mental maps will keep shifting. I think the Indo-Pacific, I argue, echoes older two-ocean frameworks of an Asia-centric maritime region, but it may change again. I mean, let's see what happens if and when Arctic shipping really has its day. Let's see what may happen if finally East Asia were to wean itself off fossil fuels, which I still think is going to be a very, very long game. But for the time being, and I mean at least for the next generation, the Indo-Pacific is going to be a useful construct for our policymakers, and we should make the most of it. Turning to the multipolarity question, look, I grappled with this question, still do. Of course, there is an unstable quality to multipolarity, depending on the choices that the big players in the system make. But we're faced with some really difficult choices here. At the extreme end of the spectrum, we do have conflict. At the other end, we do have capitulation. And my book makes the argument that there's a range of gradations in between, and we need to aim, frankly, for the moment, just for the realistic gradation of coexistence. I think coexistence is about as good as it's going to be for certainly many years to come. And multipolarity can be our friend in maintaining that point of coexistence. But to be, I guess, a little bit academic about it, I'd say really what the book is advocating is a heteropolarity. We're looking at multipolarity, but of course at one level, at the level of sheer economic and military weight, of course the United States and China are going to be in a league of their own. It's just that the middle powers have considerably more agency, including agency to complicate life for a China that I think has much less of a clear strategy than it likes to tell us. We need to accentuate that agency. And it's striking that so many of the middle players have been trying to use that in different ways in recent years. Diplomacy still matters. Yes, ASEAN is frustrating, but I think Indonesia's embrace of the Indo-Pacific idea and its use of ASEAN-centric institutions hasn't gone away. And at this stage, China feels the need to pay, I guess, at least lip service to those institutions. I think already Europe is beginning to turn, particularly France and Britain to some extent. And the French are still a player in the Indo-Pacific. We shouldn't forget that. So, I don't think I'm offering a kind of a magical solution by any means, but I think that if we can strengthen multipolarity through minilateralism, through small groups getting together to really provide some pillars of capability in that multipolar environment, and that's where Australia, Japan, and India matter, then I think we're going part of the way. I'd also just conclude on this point that goes back to a point that both you and Bonnie have raised, which is about American leadership. And one of the arguments I've tried to add some subtlety to, or to challenge really with a bit of a reality check, is the argument that in the end, the future of this region is all about the United States and China. And unless America maintains primacy and shows consistent leadership, then we have to accept Chinese hegemony. I think almost every country in the region would not like that outcome, and in fact, there's good reasons to challenge it. The argument I make is that if the United States is even remotely serious about competing with China globally, and I believe it is, and I believe the bipartisan mood on this issue, or at least the mood across the political spectrum on this issue in the United States this year is evidence of that, then the United States is going to have to remain engaged to a significant degree in the Indo-Pacific, and that does not have to be primacy, it does not have to be leadership on every issue. And I think that will be enough, provided that the United States can maintain its alliances and, I guess, regain some of the confidence that those alliances need. And I guess if I'm taking sides in the US election this year, that's as far as I'll go.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say, don't worry, we are remotely interested. Look, since 1783, as I point out in my book, the American people have resisted efforts for hegemonic takeover of the Pacific. And if you look at public opinion polls, congressional attitudes, there's no indication that has changed, despite the many idiosyncrasies in our political system right now. We have some really good questions queued up here, so I better get to them while we have time. A couple of people actually asked about the European angle. Where do you see Britain, France, the EU perhaps more broadly, or even NATO in this strategy? And to what extent do you worry about the EU or key European partners being neutralized by China's diplomacy, coercion, Belt and Road?
Yep. Okay. Look, very, very simple. Look, throughout history, I think the Indo-Pacific has been, and particularly if you go back to from the colonial era onwards, this has been almost a kind of a global region. It sounds like a paradox, but it's the region where the interests of all players are engaged. That's very much the case today, and that's one of the arguments why I think the sea lanes, and particularly, but not only the South China Sea, are going to remain everyone's business. That includes Europe as significant trading powers, but also France in particular is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific, and Britain is not completely, if you like, disengaged. What's striking is that firstly, to answer the second part of your question, we're now seeing the beginnings of, I think, long-term disillusionment and, in some cases, resistance to, I guess, China's agenda in Europe and in, as you say, neutralising Europe on the world stage. And again, even a weaker Europe, just as even a relatively weakened or relatively self-harming, if you like, America in recent years, is still going to be a very powerful actor in the long term, unless we're looking in, I guess, at scenarios of total conflict, of total war. But given I think the sensitivity of China to sustained pushback, I wouldn't rule the Europeans out on 5G, on human rights, on really rightly sticking their noses into global affairs, as they've often been good at in the past. I think the Europeans are now in play and still matter. I don't make an argument that somehow we're going to see Europe as a military actor in the Indo-Pacific making a decisive difference. But I think in many ways that's not the point. If at least we can see a sustained presence in the Indian Ocean of European navies, and remember that in the counter-piracy operations in 2008, which my book argues were in fact a pivotal moment in this turn towards the modern Indo-Pacific, because pretty much every Indo-Pacific navy, particularly the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, the Americans, the Europeans, the Russians, everyone was there in the Indian Ocean fighting piracy. The Europeans are still a significant player in that part of the Indo-Pacific, where in fact China's vulnerabilities are greatest. And then finally, on the non-military levels of strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific, the geoeconomics, the development side of things. I make an argument in the book that the best way to manage and counter the power play of BRI is not to compete in the sheer quantity of concrete and steel and, I guess, corruption of local elites that goes on through the BRI. It's actually about building the antibodies in regional countries to help small countries or developing countries use China's money wisely, make their decisions wisely, and use alternatives where they can. Japanese, American, European, Australian, whatever. Europe still has a really big role to play in building that kind of I guess, protections, governance in local societies, even a scaled-down version of Europe's development assistance to poorer countries in the Indo-Pacific is going to have an impact, just as Australia, Japan, the US, even India do. And that may well be enough to ensure that the benefits of, including the benefits of Chinese investment, are felt without all of the negative strategic consequences. So Europe's part of the solution. I certainly don't harbour any illusion that Europe's going to save the day.
So another question from Capitol Hill, from the Congress, not from Speaker Pelosi, but someone else up there, is about the Quad, and asks a little cynically, since the Quad is the low-hanging fruit, if you were going to operationalize your strategy, you would think that, for example, Australia participating in Malabar exercises with the US, Japan, and India would be an obvious first step, and yet those things aren't happening. And for the Quad to work, the Australia-India relationship has to work. So how would you answer that question / critique?
So the Quad's a fascinating thing. It's been, more words have been written about the Quad than have ever been uttered, I think, by officials in Quad meetings. You know this from personal experience, I suspect, Mike. But look, the best thing that the Quad has done is that it's made the world safe for trilateralism and a strengthened web of bilateral relations in the Indo-Pacific. While the Quad's been this perfect lightning rod for, I guess, Chinese concern and diplomatic démarches and attention and so on, a lot of the real action has happened bilaterally and trilaterally. Australia and India, India and Japan, the United States and India and so forth. All of those four players and others increasingly are beginning to build this multipolar security web that will complicate the choices for China. The Quad doesn't need to turn into a hard alliance, and certainly not a hard alliance tomorrow, for it to have this enduring impact. So this sort of almost fetishization of Malabar as being the be-all and end-all, I think, is a bit of a distraction. It would be great, of course, to have quadrilateral security exercises on a regular basis. It would be great if Australia was a participant in Malabar, which of course, in fact, began as a bilateral India-Japan exercise. But it doesn't matter that much, because at the same time, the bilateral Australia-India relationship, has gone from strength to strength. I mean, the Australian and Indian navies train together and exercise together in ways that actually in some ways have been sometimes more substantial than some of the Malabar serials. The politics of Malabar has been complicated. That's a pity, but I think we'll get there. And I think in the meantime, if that serves as a distraction for China, then fine.
So I have a question here about Russia and how Russia plays in this multipolarity.
Yeah.
But I want to throw in my own question about Korea. The Achilles heel, in my view, in the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, as it's evolved in both Washington and Tokyo, and an original sin, kind of Achilles heel, to mix metaphors, a real weakness in Mahanian thinking overall, Mahanian, is the Korean Peninsula. And you can just see how Korea does not fit very well in the FOIP strategy. Part of that's problems in Seoul. So, how does Korea fit? I think Korea is pretty darn important. If you think about it, the last time Chinese and Americans were killing each other in large numbers, it was on the Korean Peninsula. If you think about every important alliance we have, including Australia and Japan, they started in the Korean War. So Korea is pivotal to the future of Asia, but it doesn't fit neatly in an Indo-Pacific concept, it seems to me. So Russia and Korea, how would you address them?
Okay. Do you have any other questions that I can take as well?
Yeah, I'll throw one more and we can wrap up, and then I'll turn to Bonnie for a benediction. I got a number of questions about institutions.
Yeah.
If we were doing this talk, or if you'd written this book a decade ago, you probably would have said a lot more about institutions, because there was a lot more hope about what might happen with ASEAN, with the East Asia Summit and so forth. So somebody asked, is there still a role for institutions to sort of begin to codify norms, if not with China, at least among the maritime powers? So yeah, Russia, Korea, institutions. If you can weave them into one sentence, you get a bonus.
I can do that. Well, the one sentence is that this is a work in progress. Look, seriously, it's an extraordinarily, cloudy, untidy picture of the regional order at the moment, if you can call it an order. And you're going back to, I guess, the starting argument of the book, but there are really two layers of argument here. There is the fact that, I guess, the interests of powers in the region have expanded across a much larger space over the last few decades. Those sea lanes that I pointed out through the maps at the start of the presentation, the dependence still on the Indian Ocean for trade and energy, that's actually more of a problem for Korea, believe it or not. I know you know this, but it's more of a problem for Korea, in fact, than it is for just about any other country. I mean, China, Japan, they all have that problem. So even if a country like the ROK chooses to be or needs to be so focused on its immediate neighbourhood concerns with its northern neighbour, with Japan, with China, with its northern sibling, I should say, with Japan and China, it still has some pretty profound interest in the wider Indo-Pacific picture, even if at the moment it's not operationalising those interests. So that's where you have to ask, how will this change over time? And the fact is that, you know, the ROK is also a blue water naval power, is interestingly also becoming a defence exporter to its neighbours. You know, the fact that it's now selling military equipment, ships and so on to, for example, the Philippines, is the beginning of a really interesting new dynamic there that will complicate life for China. But I agree that Korea is going to be a major complication in seeing the region in this way. But I would just note that the Korean Peninsula is as much of, if not more than, a challenge for China as it is for many of the other countries in the region. So it's also going to be a major impediment to China fulfilling this kind of greater regional dominance that it seems to be almost impulsively reaching for. On Russia, I would say again, the Russians are really torn on this issue of whether, in fact, they want to see the Indo-Pacific as the single maritime region, single maritime system that I argue it is. The Russian foreign minister has openly criticised the idea of the Indo-Pacific, and that's a fine endorsement, I would say. But the fact is that Russia itself likes pan-regional visions. Look at its own idea of itself as a Eurasian power. Look at the way in which it tries to project the idea, the shadow, that it really is almost China's ally in the region. Russia's going to find itself continually entangled in the Indo-Pacific power plays, and it's going to be, I think, only often semi-capable of making a difference in the region, more as a spoiler than as a problem solver. But the Russian Navy still likes to show presence in the Indo-Pacific. We've had some pretty troubling visits occasionally, even as far away as Australia. I don't think that Russia's rejection of the Indo-Pacific idea should be necessarily a problem for us all. I think instead Russia's still coming to terms after all these centuries with its identity regional as a global player. And I would conclude with this point on Russia. Russia and China like to portray themselves as these allies in the making that will therefore deter the US and other powers really from making life difficult for either of them. But the Russia-India relationship, the Russia-Vietnam relationship, there's enough spanners in the works there for China where Russia's going to continue to have divided loyalties. And I think until we see the day that Russia stops selling military equipment to countries that have their own rivalries with China, and until we see the day that Russia is really willing to take real strategic risk in the Indo-Pacific on China's behalf, I think we can set its role in the region within manageable bounds.
Bonnie, concluding thought for everyone?
Sorry, institutions.
Oh, institutions, right.
So many have said, well, where are the Indo-Pacific institutions? And again, this is all about the reality and the naming. I mean, I don't really care if countries in the region play the game of using Indo-Pacific terminology or not. You know, that's taken off faster than any of us expected, and it actually doesn't matter at the end. It's how the countries behave that matters. And in the development of regional institutions, one of the striking, stories that my book tries to tell is that, in fact, most of them already are Indo-Pacific institutions. The ASEAN-centric institutions, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting +8, and so forth, these essentially are Indo-Pacific in character already. They have Australia and India in them, even though that was something that China resisted very much at the time. Bigger question is, what do we do with the institutions? And you're absolutely right to point out that they are underperforming, they're weak, they haven't developed anywhere near as much as some of us would have hoped. But being realistic, they still play a role, and perhaps the greatest role is that they are venues for the minilateral groupings to caucus, to try to hold China to account where they can. And in fact, over time, if China ends up openly challenging these institutions, that itself will be a kind of, I think, a galvanizing force for the Indo-Pacific resistance that my book talks about. What we don't need is a kind of a single grand multilateral Indo-Pacific institution where everyone from Mozambique to the Marshall Islands is present, because we've already got the UN General Assembly.
Bonnie?
Right. Well, we're already over time, but really this has been a terrific conversation. We're going to have to reconvene in a few years and see how the Indo-Pacific is going. I must say that I'm more concerned about Russia and the Russia-China alignment than you are, because I have found these two countries able to compartmentalize their differences. China looks the other way when Russia is, for example, the state-run energy company Rosneft was drilling at Vanguard Bank, and the Chinese survey ship at the same time was in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. And there were different interests there between Russia and China. But that doesn't undermine their cooperation on other issues. So I think they have this ability to just put on the shelf the things they disagree about and forge cooperation where they do agree. And I feel like the United States and other countries are pushing China and Russia together in a way that we may come to regret if we see in the Indo-Pacific that there is going to be this alignment that China has with Russia, that it tries to operationalize in ways that is contrary to our interests. So maybe we have to think about what are the negative relationships that could develop in the region that we have to make sure we avoid. I would put that on the agenda. And then we could also talk about at some future date North Korea and where that is going in terms of its relationship with China, which seems to be strengthening, although North Korea is not a priority for China. I think that China looks at the Korean Peninsula and prioritizes its own influence and relations with both parts of the peninsula as it can control events going forward. But I think Mike is right to point out that Korea has really been important in the past, and we should not dismiss its role in the future.
So many problems, but
Yep.
But the enduring quality of this book and this concept of an Indo-Pacific is that it will align the U.S. and Australia, Japan and India, and other maritime democracies, and that is our best play for all of these uncertainties. I have a lot of really good questions, but I know that most of them are answered in the book. So I'll just end by saying, for those of you who didn't get your question answered, there is an answer, and it's in Rory Medcalf's excellent book, Indo-Pacific Empire, China, America, and the Contest for the World's Pivotal Region. Thanks, Rory. Thanks, Bonnie. And thank you all for joining us at CSIS today.
Thank you so much.